Late one night, Officer Linda Parker's hand collided with a man's face only to discover that he was the new chief of police. How did it come to this brutal turning point, and would that single act destroy her career or force her to face a truth she'd buried for years? The night was quiet, the sort of shift Officer Linda Parker didn't usually mind on the deserted streets of Lakewood, a mid-sized city that seemed to wind down by 10 p.m. The occasional set of headlights pierced the darkness, but otherwise, it was still. Linda sat in her patrol car beside an empty parking structure, taking a half-hearted sip from what was left of her lukewarm coffee. A dull chatter droned through the radio, announcing a couple of routine calls, nothing serious. It was a lull she normally appreciated, but tonight that calm felt almost too heavy, as if something was about to happen. That was when she noticed it, a sleek black sedan cruising through a quiet intersection a block up. Its paint job glistened under the hazy glow of streetlights, clearly the sort of expensive car you'd associate with a high-powered attorney, doctor, or executive. It stood out like a polished gem in an otherwise dull setting. Squinting, Linda watched the driver make a right turn without signaling. A small infraction, hardly worth blinking an eye at on a typical shift. But she needed something to break the monotony, or so she told herself. Letting out a tense breath, she set down the coffee and switched on the patrol lights, pulling onto the road. The red and blue flashes reflected against the sedan's glossy exterior as it rolled smoothly to a stop at the curb. Linda's pulse inexplicably quickened. She'd done thousands of stops before, so why was her adrenaline spiking now? Exiting her cruiser, she kept one hand near her belt, scanning the area. The hush of the city and the warm, stagnant air surrounded them, heightening her sense of focus. As she approached the driver's side window, it rolled down at a deliberate pace, revealing a man in his mid-40s, black, sporting a neat beard and wearing a sharply tailored gray suit. Everything about him, from the subtle confidence in his posture to the calm set of his jaw, exuded control. His hands rested openly on the wheel, fingers barely twitching. No evident nerves, no anxious movements. And for some reason, that unsettled Linda more than if he'd been frantic. "License and registration," she said, her tone harsher than she intended. He nodded without so much as an eye roll, reaching carefully into the glove compartment. His voice came out measured and steady. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" Linda crossed her arms, suddenly aware of the tension in her shoulders. "You failed to use your turn signal." A subtle flicker passed across the man's features. "Did I?" he asked, still calm, almost clinically so. That composure grated on her. "License and registration," she repeated. He complied, slipping the documents into her hand. Linda barely looked at the name Donovan Price before zeroing in on his cool demeanor again. Too calm, too confident, definitely not afraid. And that fact sat like a stone in her gut. "Do you live around here?" she asked, tapping her foot in an effort to maintain some veneer of control. He let out a quiet breath. "I don't see how that's relevant." Her jaw clenched. She'd been on the force for over a decade, and rarely had she felt so, challenged by someone simply existing. "Step out of the vehicle." For the first time, the man's expression shifted, faint surprise registering in the slight upward quirk of his eyebrow. "What?" "Step out," Linda repeated. A subtle tension rippled through his posture, but he unbuckled and swung the door open. He was taller than she'd anticipated, broad across the shoulders. No aggression in his movements, just that unwavering sense of self-control. She jerked her head toward the rear of the car. Hands on the trunk. Another slow exhale, but he complied. As soon as his palms touched the cool metal, Linda felt the balance tip. She pressed a firm hand on his shoulder blade, telling herself she was simply following procedure. That was before something inside her snapped. Her hand struck out, landing a jarring slap across his cheek, a sudden movement she barely registered until it was done. The slap rang out like thunder in the stillness. Donovan's head jerked to the side. He froze for an instant, posture rigid. Linda's stomach plummeted as she realized what she had done. Instead of cursing or lashing out, he turned back slowly, his expression unreadable, no rage, no shock, just an unsettling calm that cut deeper than any shout could have. Moving with an almost infuriating patience, he reached into his suit jacket. Linda's instincts screamed at her to draw her weapon, but she couldn't move, pinned by a sense of dread. Donovan pulled out a small leather wallet and flipped it open, a silver badge glinted under the streetlight. Chief of Police Donovan Price. Linda felt the blood drain from her face. He was her boss. The new chief, in fact. She stumbled back, mind whirling. Donovan tucked the ID away without another word. He didn't raise his voice or demand she get on her knees to beg forgiveness. He simply stood there, letting the silence weigh 1,000 times heavier than if he screamed. A sudden wash of headlights signaled another patrol car pulling up behind them. Officer Jake Turner hopped out, his voice carrying across the street, "Everything okay, Parker?" He hadn't seen the slap, obviously. Linda swallowed, heart hammering. Maybe she could salvage this, if only. "I'm fine," Donovan cut in smoothly, adjusting his suit jacket as if the entire stop had been routine. He didn't spare Turner a glance, though his eyes stayed locked on Linda with a quiet intensity. "Am I free to go, Officer Parker?" Jake blinked, glancing between them with obvious confusion. Linda felt a cold sweat break out beneath her uniform. She coughed, struggling to find her voice. "I." A hollow laugh escaped Donovan's lips, devoid of humor. "Officer Parker," he repeated, voice calm, "am I being detained?" Jake's expression grew more puzzled, picking up on the tension. Linda forced the words through a suddenly tight throat. "No, sir." His eyes never left hers as he nodded once. Then he got back into his sedan, started the engine, and was gone, slipping into the night. As the taillights faded, Linda realized her hands were trembling. She also realized that the worst was yet to come. Back home, her bed felt alien, sheets tangled around her as she stared at the ceiling, replaying that moment over and over. Donovan's silence felt more damning than any fury. Why hadn't he exploded? Would he let this slide? Part of her couldn't decide which was more terrifying, an immediate confrontation or the prospect of being left to twist in the wind, waiting for repercussions. She finally drifted into a fitful sleep near dawn, only to be yanked awake hours later by the shrill ring of her phone. Internal Affairs. A single text message, instructing her to appear at the chief's office immediately. She nearly dropped her phone. The dreaded moment was here. The drive across Lakewood felt interminably slow. Traffic lights seemed to conspire against her, each one turning red at the worst time. Each stop hammered home the gravity of what she'd done. By the time she reached the station, she was clammy with sweat. A few fellow officers clustered by the glass windows, their stares slipping away whenever her eyes flicked in their direction. Word traveled fast in the corridors of any police department. She rode the elevator up, knuckles white on the railing. Outside Chief Price's office, she took a steadying breath and knocked. "Come in." His voice was mild. She stepped inside to see not only Donovan seated behind the desk but also Captain Derek Ortiz from Internal Affairs, arms crossed. Silence gripped the room for several seconds. Finally, Donovan nodded toward a chair. "Officer Parker," he said, expression reserved. "Sit." Linda sank down, her heart pounding. Donovan leaned back, his gaze never leaving her. "Tell me," he began quietly, "how would you describe last night's traffic stop?" Her mouth felt like sandpaper. "Routine stop for failure to signal," she managed. Donovan's only reaction was a slight nod. "And what happened next?" She swallowed. I asked for ID. The driver she couldn't bring herself to say you. Wasn't cooperating. He flicked his eyes toward Captain Ortiz. Captain, do we consider asking why one is being stopped to be uncooperative? Ortiz barely moved. Not typically. Only if the individual refuses to comply. Donovan shifted his gaze back to Linda. Did I refuse to comply, Officer Parker? She shook her head. No, sir. He tapped a single finger on the desk. Then why did you strike me? The question hovered in the air. Linda tried to find some justification, a sudden threat, a flash of movement, but there was nothing. She lost control. There was no excuse. Donovan's voice remained almost eerily calm. Did you feel you were in danger? Did I raise a hand? Did I insult you? Her shoulders sagged. No, sir. His eyes narrowed in quiet disappointment. Then why? She couldn't answer, not in any way that would make sense out loud. Donovan let the silence stretch, as if to drive home the gravity of her actions. After an excruciating pause, he pushed a paper across the desk. Her heart sank. Suspension. Indefinite leave pending formal review. 15 years in uniform, not a single mark on her record, undone in one impulsive act. She never felt more humiliated or lost. Donovan simply stood, nodding to Captain Ortiz. Dismissed, was all he said. He didn't lecture her, didn't hurl accusations. As Linda rose on unsteady legs, he added quietly, "We're not finished." She stumbled out, suspension notice clutched in sweaty fingers. It was like she was outside her own body, watching her steps as she headed to the parking lot. The notice's bold print, administrative leave, seemed to weigh her arms down. The next few days were torture. Time crawled. No calls from her usual friends on the force, no texts inviting her out for a drink. She was a pariah. Her mind churned with what-ifs and regrets. Maybe if she just let him drive off. Maybe if she recognized the new chief. Maybe if she hadn't let her anger and biases bubble up. But it was too late for maybes. On the fourth day, her phone buzzed again. A single name on the caller ID, Donovan Price. Her stomach clenched. Answering, she barely forced out a hello. Before his low voice said, "Meet me at Elmview Park in 10 minutes. Then he hung up. Anxious curiosity warred with dread as she got in her car. Elmview Park was nearly deserted at midday, just a few joggers, a mother pushing a stroller, an older man reading on a bench. Donovan was easy to spot, standing near a willow tree by the water's edge. He didn't turn as she approached, hands stuffed in his pockets. "You know why I didn't report you to internal affairs the same night?" he asked, still facing the pond. She swallowed. "I know." He finally glanced her way. "I wanted you to sit with it. To feel what it means to lose control like that. And to understand why." Linda stiffened. I do." He shook his head. "Not yet, you don't." She rubbed her temple, frustration gnawing at her. "Then why call me out here?" Donovan gestured for her to sit on a nearby bench. She hesitated but complied. He sat next to her, elbows resting on his knees, silent for a moment. "Have you ever been pulled over for no reason, Parker?" She blinked, uncertain. "I mean, once or twice for speeding or a busted light." He cut her off gently. "Unjustified stops. Asked to explain yourself just for driving through your own neighborhood." Her chest tightened. "No." Donovan exhaled. "I've lost count how many times I have. Different cities, different states, doesn't matter. Always the same questions. Why are you here? Where are you going? He paused, letting that sink in. You hit me because you were frustrated I didn't act afraid of you. Her stomach churned at the bluntness. That's not, but it was. She saw the truth in every memory of that night. Why did my composure bother you so much? He pressed. She had no quick answer. The words from her mind tangled. Donovan's gaze went back to the pond. Ask yourself that. Because if you don't, nothing changes. He stood, brushing off invisible dust from his slacks. I didn't call you here to humiliate you. I called you here because you have a choice. Linda looked up, frowning. What choice? You can treat it like a slip-up, do the bare minimum, and go right back to how you were, he said, voice quiet. Or you can really face what made you view me as a threat and work on that on yourself. Then, with no further explanation, he turned and walked away. Linda watched his figure grow smaller until he vanished among the trees. A strange cocktail of relief and shame sat like a brick in her chest. The following 3 days were a mental battlefield. She paced, tried to watch TV, scrolled through her phone, aimlessly cleaned her apartment. Nothing distracted her from Donovan's words. He was right. The worst part was realizing she couldn't even pinpoint when she started seeing black men in expensive cars as a risk. It was just there. A reflex. A bias she never confronted until it exploded in one horrifying moment. On the 4th morning, Internal Affairs called again. Linda steeled herself, driving to the station with a grim sense of inevitability. She didn't bother checking to see who was staring this time, she already knew. Upstairs, she found a cramped conference room with 3 people inside, Captain Ortiz, Investigator Valerie Cho, and Chief Donovan Price. Valerie motioned for her to sit. Officer Parker, she began, flipping open a file. Let's revisit the events of that traffic stop. Linda nodded, though her throat was painfully dry. Yes, ma'am. Valerie looked over a printed statement. So, you observed a failure to signal and initiated a stop. At what point did physical force come into play? Linda exhaled slowly. I struck the driver after I had him step out of the vehicle. Valerie raised an eyebrow. You stated you believed the driver was uncooperative. In what way? Silence stretched. Linda could feel Donovan's presence across the table, unwavering. He asked why he was being stopped and I took that as resistance, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Valerie exchanged a glance with Captain Ortiz. Then she turned to Donovan. Chief Price, any comments? He studied Linda but answered calmly, not at this time. Nodding, Valerie set down the file. Officer Parker, you have a clean record over 15 years. That weighs in your favor. However, this was unjustified use of force. She paused, letting the words sink in. We're recommending a minimum of 60 days suspension without pay, alongside mandatory de-escalation and bias training. Any similar future incident would result in immediate termination. Linda swallowed the relief threatening to mix with shame. She might still have a job, but only barely. Understood, she managed. Valerie and Ortiz stood. We'll finalize the paperwork, Valerie said. You're dismissed. As Linda turned to leave, Donovan spoke for the first time. Parker. She paused. His gaze was steady. This isn't over. She nodded, hands trembling slightly, and left. Those words echoed in her mind as she walked out of the conference room. No, it wasn't It couldn't be. The training that followed was humbling in a way she never imagined. A windowless, cramped space with a dozen other officers, some rookies who messed up early, others with longer tenures like her. The trainer, Rita Morrison, a retired detective in her early 60s, wasted no time on pleasantries. She started off by playing body cam footage of a routine traffic stop gone wrong. A black driver pulled over for a trivial reason, tension escalating as the white officer grew impatient. A push, a shove, eventually a takedown. When the video ended, Rita crossed her arms. Let us talk about assumptions. No one spoke. She let the silence drag, then her eyes landed on Linda. Officer Parker, what did the officer see when he pulled that man over? Linda felt a flush creep to her cheeks. A threat, she admitted. Rita's gaze didn't waver. And what did you see when you pulled over Chief Price? The room went absolutely still. Linda swallowed hard. A threat, she repeated, voice thick with regret. Rita nodded slowly. Was he? The question hung in the air. Linda pressed her lips together, shame swirling in her chest. No, she finally whispered. The trainer pinned her with a stare. So where did that idea come from? Linda couldn't dodge the question. It was woven from years of subtle remarks, half jokes in the locker room, headlines that fed her unconscious biases, the assumption that a black man in a nice car at night must be up to something. She didn't have a neat, simple answer. But for the first time, she wasn't trying to deny it. Rita didn't congratulate her. She simply nodded. Good. The rest of the training was no less intense, each session confronting the blind spots that Linda had never realized she possessed. By the time her 60 days were up, she wasn't magically cured of every bias, but she felt the seeds of real awareness taking root. When the suspension ended and she walked back into the Lakewood Police Department, it all looked the same: phones ringing off the hook, officers huddled over desks, the pungent smell of burnt coffee in the break room. Yet everything felt different to Linda, weighed down by the knowledge of how easily she could have ruined a life, and her own, by letting prejudice guide her actions. She set her bag on her old desk and took a moment to steady her breathing. Across the room, she spotted Donovan walking from the briefing area. He caught her eye and paused. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then he dipped his head slightly. "Welcome back, Parker," he said quietly. "Thank you, sir." He disappeared into his office, leaving her with a tense sense of relief. She wasn't sure what the future held, but at least she was here alive, employed, and maybe better equipped to question her instincts. That evening, when the station had mostly cleared out, Linda found herself still at her desk, turning her badge over in her hands. She remembered how she used to take it for granted that she was one of the good cops. Now, the weight of it felt different, heavier, more complicated. On impulse, she walked to Donovan's office and knocked. "Come in," he said, glancing up from a stack of paperwork. She stood there, uncertain, shifting her footing. I've been thinking about everything," Linda said quietly. "About what you said, the questions you asked." Donovan clasped his hands, leaning back. "And?" She drew a breath. "I don't have all the answers. But I'm trying." He regarded her for a moment. "You want to get them all right away. That's not how this works." Nodding slowly, she murmured, "Still, it's a start." She headed for the door, then paused when he called her name. "Parker," he said, voice calm but firm, "remember, this is about what you do when no one's watching, not just when you're on the clock." She felt a tightness in her chest, a mix of resolve and lingering guilt. "I understand, Chief." Leaving his office, she realized this was far from a neat ending. It was the beginning of an ongoing fight to recognize her own blind spots. But at least now, she saw them for what they were instead of denying their existence. Message outro. Prejudice doesn't always shout, sometimes it whispers in our assumptions and surfaces before we realize what is happening. Officer Linda Parker truly believed she was fair until one night, one impulsive act shattered her self-image and forced her to confront the hidden bias lurking beneath her badge. Chief Donovan Price didn't respond with rage or immediate punishment. He made her sit with it, letting the weight of her actions speak for itself. Now the question is, did Linda really change, or is she just going through the motions? Have you ever caught yourself making a quick judgment about someone based on appearances or stereotypes? Share your thoughts in the comments. This is where real conversation begins. Welcome to Epic Stories, where we tackle the tough, uncomfortable truths through storytelling. If this tale made you think or challenged what you believe, give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more stories that aim to question perspectives, and drop a comment below. Let us talk about the things that truly matter, one story at a time.